think as the years go by, I become more and more sort of a believer in fates and signs. And yesterday night, I broke my glasses, which I fixed today with super glue. But I mean, I took it as a sign that you're going to talk about the future. You know, we're going to take away your eyesight. I'm going to talk a little bit more, perhaps, what I thought I could, that the way in which I could address the theme of this conference is to really sort of think a little bit about what, for me, represents future and how it is enacted, and how history plays into considerations of the future. Lucia mentioned that yesterday that architects are only one audience of architectural historians, and this is definitely one of those talks where you're only one audience, right? So there's a sort of a little bit of an off-architecture message, if you like, but there's good enough architecture in it, I think. So hang on in there. I beg your indulgence. But I'll just start. Theories of memory that swirl around critiques of museomatic and preservation practices in the art and architectural history fields pay little heed to the fact that the tropes of memory in our world today have long passed from the politics of writing and remembering history to pieces of informational code or data. Few, if any, architectural historians bother themselves with that preservational politics called the Human Genome Project, or for that matter, the decidedly atavistic conflicts over stem cell research. But such museums, aka data storehouses, are being built every day. The Svalbard archipelago lies midway between mainland Norway and the Arctic Pole, comprising some of the northernmost village-sized settlements of the world. Deep in a permafrost-coated mountainside of these islands, some 145 meters deep, are 3 vault rooms, each approximately 26 meters long, 9.5 meters wide, and 5 meters high. The rooms are further refrigerated from the surrounding atmosphere to a temperature of minus 18 degrees centigrade. Should they lose power, the temperature would rise to no more than minus 3% of the surrounding bedrock, enough to maintain the living contents of these walls for 200 years. The facility staff visit only when adding to the wall's contents a series of airlock doors like submarines or space capsules keep the refrigerated air from escaping. This is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, nicknamed the Doomsday Vault. The vault has the capacity to store 4.5 million seed samples, 500 each, more than all of those cumulatively conserved by all the 1,400 gene banks found all over the world. Svalbard is designed as a backup deposit for these standalone national seed banks, ready to replenish stocks should these be destroyed as they were during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. In the gene bank, the past, so it is claimed, materially preserves the future. Unlike historians, scientists have no problem with questions of cultural context. The Earth is only one text, and in the linguistic uniformity of genomic code, freeze-dried pollen from as far back as the Mesozoic era appear as fundamentally of the same material order as the brown rice that you get from Whole Foods. Coding makes not only the pre-human past readable, but also we surmise presents the material element by which to reconstruct humanity itself in the aftermath of cataclysm. In the aftermath of man-made or natural blight, these preserved genes will prefer the cipher from which entire ecologies and economies can be rebuilt. One gets a sense that it is not just the past that is being coded, but the order of humanism itself. The PR material for Svalbard expresses particular concern and solicitousness about developing countries, given their institutional, financial, and infrastructural problems or vulnerabilities. In these contexts, one need not wait for out-and-out cataclysm. Mere mismanagement is enough to wipe out a region's biodiversity in the case of war and blight. Not to fear, Svalbard will safeguard their seed like the Bank of England safeguards their gold. This is because Norway evidently presents the opposite of this vulnerability, making it an ideal location for such a bank. Quote, the political situation is stable. Norway is a trusted country. It is also unusually, quote unquote, global in its outlook. This self-regarding cosmopolitanism is also expressed in a self-regarding benevolence. Norway has no dog in any fight. It is, quote, generous and has no perceived conflict of interest in hosting the site, end quote. We are told that depositors retain property rights over what is deposited, and the facility can be used free of charge by any gene bank or organization in any country. Of course, you have to afford the airfare there. Whoever deposits owns. No scrutiny will be leveled as to by what ground the depositor came into possession of such property. Such, one assumes, is the face of the secular, quote-unquote, parliament of things and beings. Perhaps I'm unconscionably paraphrasing Bruno Latour here, where little assemblages of genetic material stand ready to regenerate distant polities and economies. Compare then this with the Naikrishi Andolan, which means New Farmers Movement or agitation, seed huts scattered throughout its centers in rural Bangladesh. Bangladesh is globalization's founding soil. It was the territory in which one of the world's earliest multinational corporations, the East India Company, established administrative suzerainty in the early 18th century. Situated largely in the flat delta of the Ganges and the Brahmaputra rivers, with 80% of its landmass constituted by floodplain, the country is seasonally inundated by floodwaters from these Himalayan rain-fed rivers, a process which also deposits enormous amounts of silt and its attendant fertilizing ecobiome of algae, microorganisms, nitrogen, and so forth. The soils of the country are thus an ever-moving layer of deposits, now settling, now breaking, to allow the next change in course of a great estuary or a new rivulet to form. It is tempting to compare the Svalbard walls bedrock with the soft, mobile terrain. Over centuries, peasants and fishermen in the Bengal Delta have learned to bend their lives and use these bounded regular cataclysms to their benefit. Planting deep and shallow water variants of paddy in alternate seasons mixed with a variety of other crops, vegetables, and edible flora, in addition to using the basins of trapped water to cultivate fish. Bangladesh is also the most densely populated patch of earth on this planet and also one of its poorest. In the 1970s, Bangladesh became the experimental fairground for the McNamara World Bank, a discursive territory particularly amenable to prophesying whatever imminent cataclysm may be seen to be threatening the then global order: poverty alleviation, population control, gender rights, environmental issues, flood action plans, and so on and so forth. In 1981, Bangladeshi feminist Farida Akhtar spoke out against the targeting of the fertility of Bangladeshi women as a threat to global prosperity. The story of the lurid images that gripped the developmental mindset in the 1970s on the coming explosion of the population bomb and the eugenicist fervor of international development agencies involving practices such as dumping untested chemical contraceptives on unsuspecting and uninformed poor women is now common knowledge that we can pass over without further mention. In the 1990s, Akhtar, with poet-activist Farhad Mazar, started to work more and more with rural populations to form the Naikrishi Andolan. In a sense, the seed huts relate to Akhtar's early realization that the developmental agency's approach towards subaltern female fertility and peasant-based agriculture drew from the same essential premise, that the practical fecundity of the poor is a problem to be eradicated at all levels. Thus, on the one hand, placed checks on women's reproductive power by chemically reengineering bodies and brainwashing minds, and on the other, devalue farmers' productive facilities by casting them as only the user-end function of a production protocol devised in corporate labs and boardrooms. Bedrooms, yeah, right. That too happens, as mere workers in a monocultural food production industry. These production protocols involve a complex suite of commodity inputs, bear with me here a little bit, patented high yield or GM seed, pesticides, insecticides, chemical fertilizers to coax the last juices of fertility from the soil, and financing that stipulates the kind of crop to be grown with a clear eye towards cash crop cultivation for the global market. The anti-germinative ingredients in the toxins used to cultivate bumper crash crops inevitably find their way into the human bloodstream, affecting both health and reproductive organs of unprotected peasant women who are deeply involved in all stages of agricultural work. Ovulation and germination are here indeed intertwined. The Naikrishi Andolan's response to these incursions are not, at least in technical terms, revolutionary. There's an emphasis, and we can sort of expect what this is. There's an emphasis on biodiversity of seed, compost-based manure, and prohibition on the use of pesticides and chemical fertilizer. Energy-intensive groundwater extraction is forbidden. No field grows only one crop. Farmers grow vegetables and legumes in between stalks of the main crop. Fields do not lie fallow in any season. Deep water rice is grown in the monsoon, and shallow water rice is grown when the rains recede. The pools of water used to submerge the paddy crop are used to cultivate fish, and so on. Naikrishi farmers have built up what might be considered a kind of open sourceware for seeds. Over 2,300 strains of rice alone have not only been documented, but are actively kept at the centers. Accessible to all members. In fact, if you go visit one of their centers, they guarantee you a different variant of rice for lunch and dinner every day. So basically that means you could be there for 3 years and not eat the same rice twice. The genetic diversity of seed is its self-protection against insect blight. The seed hut is built on high ground, on stilts, but has neither artificially maintained environment nor strong defensive walls. The only energy usage is of one or two dimly lit bulbs, the very least needed to read the labels on the sample pots or bottles. Seeds are kept following ancient practice, rubbed with neem oil, it's a kind of locally available oil, and are expected to last no more than 3 years, after which they're replaced by new varieties. What the Svalbard folk apparently do not know, and what the Naikrishi farmer knows, or most farmers know, is that the ecobiome is not static. It constantly changes. Yesterday's seed will very likely not withstand the blights of tomorrow. And the knowledge of the practices needed to regenerate this seed in the event of cataclysm now lies dispersed in the few 100,000 hands that work with this material daily, not a small technocratic or scientific elite. Most importantly, women exclusively manage, guard, and upkeep the seed huts. This is a spectacular political theater, if you may. The fertility of seed and the fertility of women are here politically and technically tied. In any case, my attempt here is not, at least in this audience, to present yet one more example of a contrast between rural activism and global technocratism. Although this is certainly how matters are being staged. It's not me who's doing this. It's already how it's going on. It's hard to see any use to the Svalbard depot in any real event, except as a mediatic science saying, quote unquote, institutional science will save the world, and its houses Europe, end quote. I'm tempted to think of the Abbé Laugier here. I think I'm the 5th guy in this conference to mention it. So I'm on to something, right? Historicism manifests itself in architecture. These are just the easy targets, and sometimes the wrong ones, or even worse, the vanguardists' pretext for passing over things that one should be paying attention to, a kind of theoretical vanguardism and an inability to read things carefully. Every kind of technological avant-gardism has nestled within it a primitive hut, and that's my point. So which of these two structures, the Svalbard gene bank or the Naikrishi hut, more approximates the primitive hut? I know you know what I think the answer is, right? But that is the less interesting point. The primitive is, by definition, the cusp where nature passes over into culture, where nature is still deemed to have the upper hand. The counterpart to the primitive, in Kant, for instance, is genius, where similar crossover happens, but culture or reason has the upper hand in that crossover. My point is that any technopolitical complex, in that it transforms the parameters of this cusp, necessarily constructs its own hierarchy of primitive and genius, of those being saved and those saving, which are key to forge the political contract through which that technopolitical regime is to be socialized. What I'm more interested in pointing out here is the irreducible mark of this origin as the origin of the political and the cosmopolitical, since it is from this invocation of the past, of memory, that a certain disequilibrium of the future gains ground. And Susan, I was reading your Hegel and Haiti book on the way here, and Just think of Hegel sort of indexing Aristotle to create the master-slave dialectic in the middle of the abolitionist movement. It's precisely that kind of ancestrality that I'm very much interested here, that kind of operation. In this conception, then, what poses itself as technological or political futurism may in fact only be the expression of the most hackneyed kind of atavism. This one. This is the one which is all about authenticity, right? And what is made in more or less available idiom may in fact be much more open to the indeterminacy of the future. Certainly, sovereignty will not have been locked in some frozen tundra to be held in abeyance for some better days yet to come. Thank you.